Hi, in this video, I'm only going to make one video tonight, unfortunately, but fortunately for me, right, and unfortunately for you, because I know you want to see so many more of my boring long videos. Anyway, yeah, so I'm going to make a video about procreation. It should be a quick one, but we'll find out if it's really quick. But it's the basic idea of how, against any reasonable logic of how reality actually works. In many cases, the more of a burden you create, the more useful you may be in many circumstances, like the burden of a violator, of being the burden of being a violator on everyone else, the burden that you have on everyone else for being a violator, and that violation is procreating against someone's consent, someone's will, and when you do that, even though you're a violator and you broke the rules of consent, the rules of at least any reasonable social standard that we should have in place in law, you become more useful, unfortunately. And you become more useful because you have a kid, and when you have a kid, that makes it so you have to be there when the kid's around, unfortunately. So you become more important than, say, a person that doesn't have a kid because you're not fulfilling the purpose of your biology, pretty much, right? So if you're not having a kid, you're useless. But you're useful until you have a child. But once you have a child, your use is not necessarily gone. It's actually, I would say, increased. And that's why it's a relevant topic I want to mention, or at least talk about, is that you do become more useful once you've had a child. It's one of those things where if you haven't had a child, it's one of those things, I suppose, where since you haven't had a child, it wants to keep you in the game. It's good to stay in the game according to the standards of evolution and biology. But once you've had a child, you become more useful because you have to be there for the child when it's um, growing up or whatever it may be. You have to be around for the child. And if that's the case, then you become more useful than, say, a person that hasn't had a child. If that's the case, then yeah, you are more useful. Yet something depends on you, and the more things depend on you, the more useful you are in feeding at least someone's addiction. So I guess that's something I get out of this topic is the more you're dependent upon, the more useful you are. And once you have a child, you have something that's dependent on you. Even though you're a violator, you should be useless, but you are useful because now something relies on you, something that you violated the consent of as well. So it's something that it works in the opposite. When you're useless, you should be useful, and when you're useful, you should be useless. In this circumstance, being a violator, obviously that's the only way the game moves forward, is if you're a violator. Therefore, being a violator to perpetuate the game, obviously you have to be useful and you have to be there for something that's um, been brought into this world. And obviously that's the way the game works. It functions on a level where it's needed on both sides, the violator and the violated. In that circumstance, the violator and the violated, according to the rules of our biology and evolution and all that neato and stuff, that you're more required at that point. You're required. You are once you've been brought into existence, it's expected of you to survive long enough to procreate yourself. But in many circumstances, that doesn't happen. And in many circumstances, a lot of violated beings, will not even make it past a certain portion of their existence before they have a nasty, or they no longer exist. They don't exist long enough, pretty much, to procreate. At that point, it just shows that you're creating a lot of things, risking the thing, a lot of lives to procreate, to have them procreate again, and only bringing them here so that you can procreate, to have them procreate. And you're risking their well-being just for them to repeat the process that you've brought them into. So it doesn't seem like a very useful mechanism. It's a mechanism that feeds on lack of consent, and it makes those people that violate that consent useful. It makes those people, the people that violate the consent, the people that are required to violate more consent. They're here to violate consent than to be here and be useful to continue that violation by having their offspring continue, because obviously once they're here, there's nothing you can do but take care of what's already here and fix the problems that are already here, and hopefully project any kind of problems you can possibly fix in the future. But there's only so much that you can do. The mechanism feeds on both of those things, and once you've done that, it's doing it so that that next thing that you violated can have a chance to violate someone else's consent. So you become more useful once you've been a violator, because now something relies on you, and that point is once something's become dependent on you, then you are more required at that point. So the more something depends on you, the more the likelihood, obviously, is that once you have a kid, something's relying on you. So by that standard, it's almost synonymous with the fact that you've had a child. Child bearers are automatically considered more useful than people that haven't had it. So once you have it, you're more useful. Once you haven't had it, but once you're beyond the age of being able to produce offspring, you become useless. Because at that point, it already assumes, the mechanism already assumes that you've already procreated. At that point, and in the procreation, and then they're on the next line is on the procreating as well, so you become useless. But when you're still in offspring-bearing ages, then obviously you're still somewhat useful, but you haven't had a child or had offspring, therefore you're not quite as useful. But the more something depends on you, the more that there is a dependence on you, the more likely that you're going to be useful. And the more likely you should be the one sticking around. But in the end, obviously the ultimate goal is to make sure none of this goes on any longer. To systematically, almost immediately, wipe out the entire population, even if it requires extreme measures. But extreme measures with the most likelihood of no suffering or pain. And if it needs to be done, by way of a law preventing people from having so many kids, and that's another solution that can be used at least the beginning stages of, say, the eradication of all life on planet Earth. So I think, that's the basic subject. It's just mentioning that obviously the more someone relies on you, the more there is a reliance on you, the more useful you are. And by the way that the child thing comes in is that obviously once you have a child, you're automatically more useful than, say, someone that doesn't have a child. By definition, synonymously, you're automatically more useful. Sorry, I'm grasping for words. So yeah, you're automatically more useful at that point. So if you don't have any kids and you have any offspring, then you're not useful in the way that something's relying on you directly, after you're one that's most responsible for bringing someone to existence. Obviously, it doesn't mean that you're not useful in some other way. You could be more useful, but it's just a good comparison to say that once you've had a child and once you've produced offspring, you're automatically more important. Because you're now something that you've violated the consent of. Now your obligation is that much greater to make sure that nothing else happens to that thing that you've made possible to be violated now that you've had them. So you've opened the doors for every other violation that happens to them. Therefore, there's more of a reliance on you to make sure there's more of an obligation on your part. And therefore, you're automatically more useful. You're more required. You're more necessary. And that's what makes the game so insidious. It requires that necessity, but it requires a necessity after you've violated consent. So you become more useful, but you have to violate the consent almost in a way of compensation for the fact that you violated consent. So it's a mechanism that equalizes out in the end. Not really, because we know it doesn't work that way. We know the rules work that way, but things don't play by the rules. They just go whichever way they want. The only rules out there are the rules of reality, in which controls our physiology and how we move, and what interactions and circumstances that control us to a certain extent. Otherwise, there's no holds bound on every single circumstance that happens. There's only ways of destroying things, and at that point you realize the game ain't really worth playing or reproducing it, because there's only a downhill game, and especially when you're relying, the people that violate become more useful after violating the consent of someone that they couldn't ask beforehand. It's a circumstance where it's impossible to ask consent beforehand, so it makes the whole game all the more insidious when it relies on all these mechanisms building up, where it requires violation of consent. The violator, sort of like the rapist, becomes more useful because it's necessary for him to, say, arrive at the trial to come to a reasonable verdict. In many circumstances, just as important as the victim of, say, of said crime or violation. But it's not the same as procreating, because you've opened the doors for every other violation that happens at that point. So I don't think there's much else to mention on that subject. It's basic dependence. The more you're dependent upon, the more useful you are. So the more useful you are, the more necessary you are, and the more it's required of you to survive. But survive for what? For them to survive, for someone else to possibly survive? There's no point to it. It's all very pointless. There's no point. It's less of a point. It's a pointless. Futile. It's very futile. All the futility in our existence. Right. Anyway, I don't think there's anything else to mention on this subject. Let's read my notes. A useful obligation. Yeah, so it makes you more important. That's the word I use in my notes. So it makes you more important. It makes you more necessary. That's the basic point. It makes you so that you're required for whatever reason it is to exist. And that's what makes the game so insidious. It makes them more useful so that they can have the thing that they violated be another violator, and so on and so forth. It requires, it's a momentum mechanism in how this thing works. And it usually goes in that direction because it's built into the biology, built into the mechanism, built into the physiology, and all that, yeah, basic stuff, this redundancies. So yeah, it's built into the mechanism. It's the basic point. It's built into the mechanism, and it's part of the mechanism that keeps driving the force forward, and it's about eliminating that force, making sure there's not as much momentum pushing the force forward, but I'm doing it by way of prevention, not by way of outright eradication, but prevention. Prevention and eradication will come on its own in many circumstances, but eradication would obviously be a more straightforward and less painful or more painless response to the issue at hand, which is procreation against someone's will, only leaving the possibility for you to be harmed negatively, and avoiding that harm and finding enjoyment and satisfaction in avoiding harm and getting what you already desired to begin with. Desires that are built up in you. You have to have the desire before you can have the satisfaction. And the satisfaction is just satisfying a desire that was already there, or avoiding a negative that you thought, oh, you tripped and your food almost fell, and you're relieved that your food didn't fall on the floor and leave a stain. You get relieved. It's like, oh, you get that little buzz in your head. You feel so satisfied. And in reality, it was just because you avoided a negative. And that's really all we're doing. So, anyway, I don't think there's really much else to mention on this subject. Not really. It's, yeah, you're more necessary the more people depend on you. That's an obvious statement. It's obvious. It's obvious. But obvious to useless things that rely on you, because they're just as useless. If you have a possibility of being useless, then they're just as likely to be useless. So you're being useful for the useless people that are just as easily being lined up for the slaughter as you are, being the one that's willing to sacrifice for the circumstance, like I mentioned before, being useful for the useless. Why sacrifice when you're just sacrificing yourself for more sacrificables to live on, to be more sacrifices? That only seems to be the reasonable expectation and reasonable answer to these issues. It doesn't seem to be that's the way it functions. That's the function of biology, reality, our function of our physiology and how it works based on our biology, like I mentioned, through evolution, and how the mechanism works based on how the physic game works, which is reality controlled, which there is no other definition other than it exists as the function and the controlling mechanism of our existence. So whatever that means. Anyway, I don't want to go on too much longer, or any longer. I mentioned the point good enough, I think. Obviously, if I have anything else to mention, I can mention it in another video. So I guess, yeah, thank you, and until next time, bye.